Hello, and welcome to another election special of the IFS Zooms In. I'm Helen Miller, Deputy Director at the IFS, and I'm joined by my colleagues Christine Farquharson and David Phillips to dig into all things local. We're going to start with levelling up. The Conservatives made this a central mission in their 2019 offer to voters. Many of the so-called red wall seats turned blue, and Boris Johnson walked into number 10 with a clear pledge to level up every part of the UK. We'll look at how that agenda has measured up, and to give you a spoiler, it's not going well. We're also going to look at local government. What does it do? Why are so many councils struggling and either nearing or reaching the point of effective bankruptcy? And what have the main parties told us about how they would fix all this mess? To continue a theme, I think we're going to be carrying on a not cheery conversation there. And last but certainly not least, we'll finish up with a look at the manifestos of Plaid Cymru and the SNP. What's the vision they're offering to voters in Wales and Scotland, and what would that mean for the rest of the UK? And finally, in an attempt to end on a less gloomy note, we'll each tell you something that we're optimistic about. So, Christine, let's jump right in with levelling up. It's the latest buzzword, but the underlying ideas, problems, policies aren't new at all. So can you set out for us, what does levelling up mean? Why do we need it?
So levelling up was, as you say, the buzzword of the 2019 campaign. And we're 5 years on and all of a sudden hearing quite a lot less about that specific turn of words. But it was a really major policy and it was a really major priority for particularly Boris Johnson's government. The idea behind levelling up was always a little bit nebulous in 2019, but the government did a lot of work actually over the following 3 years to really pin down exactly what they meant. And broadly, I think the mission can be summarised as, number one, improve the UK's overall performance on a bunch of different dimensions. And number two, reduce some of the regional inequalities in that performance. So bringing up the bottom, but also levelling up in the sense of improving the country as a whole. The government set out in February 2022, so kind of after COVID, but right before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a really big, really detailed, actually really like techie, geeky, nerdy treatment of what they meant by levelling up, a real attempt to try and define this. And they came up with 12 missions. These missions cover a lot of different areas. They go through R&D spending, employment, health, well-being, education, transport, devolution, probably a handful more as well. So really trying to look across the piece and in each area set out what should be happening for the UK as a whole and how should we be reducing some of those regional inequalities in performance too. And one of the really nice things actually about that piece of work was there was a serious effort to say we're going to set really ambitious targets for 2030. And we're actually going to, unusually for a government, provide quite a bit of detail on how we want to be measured against those targets. What would it mean to achieve success here? So that is not something that you always get, but something that I think is really important actually in taking something that's been an issue since at least the 1930s that various governments of various stripes have tried to deal with and really try and pin down exactly what we mean in an effort to start actually making some progress.
Great. So we're talking about regional inequalities, long been an issue in the UK. In fact, one of the statistics you had in your recent report was that the UK is one of the most unequal countries in the developed world. So it's pause on that, one of the most unequal. So parts of the UK just do way worse on a whole bunch of measures than the best performing parts. So clearly a big issue. It's been an issue for a long time. As you said, to their credit, the government set out, clearly their policy aims, 12 key missions. We're not going to run you through all 12 today, although Christine and other colleagues have written a wonderful report, 12 nice key charts. You can flick through them at your leisure and see how it's all going. But let's just pick up on a couple of them. And if we can, I'd love to start with education, because the statistic that you put out that's stuck in my mind that I can't stop thinking about is about education and the outcomes for the end of primary school. So tell us, how's that going?
So the mission here, the government's aim that they set out was that by 2030, 90% of 11-year-olds leaving primary school should be meeting the expected standard in reading, in writing, and in maths. And actually, they got a lot of stick at the time that was put out. There were a lot of people saying, only 90%. What do you mean? This is so unambitious. The backdrop to that was at the time the Levelling Up paper was released, the latest data from 2019 showed that around 65% of 11-year-olds were actually meeting the standard in those three areas. So, take a minute, think about that. Only 2/3 of 11-year-olds are actually meeting the expected standards at the end of primary school. And we know from other work that amongst those who don't meet that standard, the probability that they go on to get 5 good GCSEs is vanishingly small, like less than 1 in 10 small.
Let's jump in. I mean, this is the statistic that's kind of stuck in my mind that I can't stop thinking about. That means over 1/3 of children are getting to 11 and they're not meeting the minimum requirements for reading, writing and numeracy. That is shocking, a third of children. And actually, I'm sure I don't want to steal your thunder, but that's even worse in some parts of the country. So that's an average statistic. In some parts of the country, half of children aren't meeting that minimum requirement.
Yeah, and in a few places, it's actually even less than half.
Shocking.
It's incredible. And I think what this, for me, really encapsulates levelling up, because there is this overall ambition to say, right now we're at 65%. Actually, the most recent data, that's gone down to 60% meeting this standard. We want to get to 90% by 2030. But even where we are right now, the 10 best performing local authorities are all in London, and only a handful are even breaching 70% meeting these standards. So this is both a real stretch goal in terms of how far there is for the UK as a whole, but also a real issue with the regional inequality we have and who's meeting it. And like I said, you might have hoped that levelling up would see us moving forward on that aim. Actually, what's happened is that we've moved backwards. The UK as a whole has fallen back, and some of those regional inequalities have gotten even starker than they were.
So we were already not doing great with our kids reaching the required standards at 11. And even in the best performing parts of the UK, 30% of 11-year-olds aren't meeting what we think they should be able to do in terms of reading, writing and maths.
Yes. And that translates into some of the other missions around skills as well. The government's levelling up mission wanted to see further education and skills increasing. What have we seen? Actually, it's fallen back across the UK, and it's fallen back more by nearly 20% in the third of areas with the lowest levels of skills to begin with. So several of these missions, there's this theme of ambition, of progress, and then actually of that progress being frustrated both overall and when we're looking at inequalities.
Okay, so education and skills not doing wonderfully. Let's pick another mission. How about we look at kind of well-being? How's that doing?
It kind of fits into the same theme. So well-being is measured. The Office for National Statistics puts out a survey, asks people how satisfied they are with their lives on a scale of 1 to 10 kind of overall. And, good news here is most people are sort of a 7 or an 8, which I think is pretty good going. I'm not sure I would always be at a 7 or an 8, so that's good. But what we've seen since the pandemic was that fell back a lot during the pandemic years. That's probably unsurprising, but it really hasn't recovered since then. And when we look at the inequalities between the most and least satisfied local authorities in the country, actually that gap has increased the most in the most recent year of data, which is 2022-23. So that to me looks like the cost of living crisis is really having an impact on life satisfaction and well-being, particularly in areas at the bottom, areas that are less satisfied and doing less well to begin with. Part of that is the COVID pandemic. It makes sense that a lot of people are less satisfied. But part of that is this very specific economic shock that we've had after that seems to be increasing inequalities as well as holding down overall satisfaction.
And just to move to that, so we're not going to run through the whole 12. I think you wonderfully summed up the overall progress in the kind of report, saying progress towards levelling up has been glacial, and on many metrics the UK as a whole has gone into reverse. So not a happy outcome. But you've also highlighted there that we've obviously been through a global pandemic. We've been through a massive cost of living crisis. Those things weren't expected in 2019. Of course, they were going to make some things difficult. So to what extent do you think here there's basically just been a bad time, a hard time for the UK, or actually has it been a policy failure not to get enough action in what, as you said, the mission was always to 2030. We weren't planning to have these finished in a couple of years. But to what extent is there a policy failure here versus just we hit on some tough times?
I think there is a real case here to say we have had unprecedentedly tough times. I would point out that the Levelling Up paper was actually published after most of the pandemic was in the past. So to some extent, those pandemic-era consequences were known about or at least predicted. Obviously, the cost of living crisis, that was not predicted at the time of the Levelling Up paper. So it genuinely has been a tough environment. But equally, if you're going to give yourself around a decade to make significant progress on something that we've been trying to crack for the last century, you are going to have to find a way of making that progress and capital either because of or despite the external influences that are happening, because of or despite these big shocks that we're seeing. And so we've ended up in a world where, partly because of these external shocks, but partly because of the policy choices that have been made in response to those external shocks, on many of these metrics, we're further behind than when we started. And we now only have 6.5 years if we're going to try and meet these targets by 2030. So the next parliament is going to be really decisive. I'm not saying that whatever government we get has to sign up to these specific missions, but there is a lot of careful thought here. There's a lot of good measurable targets that have been set out. And it would be a real shame to just abandon all of that completely if what you want to do as a government is make progress on these underlying issues of regional inequality and bringing the UK average up as a whole as well.
And if I can come in there a second as well, I think one thing that was sort of lacking in the Levelling Up white paper, and certainly been lacking in policy, is connecting the ambitions with what happens that most direct lever government has to achieve some of these, which is how it allocates funding across the country. There's no proper system in place for local government funding to reflect the needs of local areas. Actually, there have been somewhat bigger increases in funding for the poorest areas over the last 4 or 5 years, but that follows much bigger cuts in the 2010s. So compared to 2010, poor areas funding is much down compared to richer areas. And looking ahead, we've heard nothing at all about funding for local government or really much about funding for levelling up. So I think, given the ambition here, it's a bit shocking that we've not seen much change so far, and little in terms of what we might see in the next parliament from the two main parties.
And it's particularly the case when a lot of the funding decisions that have been made look really just very odd. I mean, the one that always stuck in my head was a couple of years ago, there was this plan of getting public chessboards into a bunch of local authorities. And they worked it out. And it was like Whitehall was deciding on which specific local authorities were going to get grants of £2,500 to put a public chessboard in a park. And it's, when you're trying to make progress on these really big underlying issues, is just juxtaposing that with the central government making those very, very, very minuscule decisions about very tiny amounts of money in public finances terms. Really, there's just a total mismatch between those two policy levers.
We can have a whole conversation about the kind of number of little small pots of funding that are floating out there, whilst not tackling the sort of big picture issues of public finance.
I mean, it's quite depressing to think that we've got a third of our kids who aren't reading well enough at 11 and we're worried about chess sets in parks. Doesn't seem to add up, does it? So levelling up, it seems clear that there is a real problem that's been identified here. It's not a new problem. It's not going to go away anytime soon. Whether the next government adopts these very specific missions or not, they should absolutely keep it as a focus. I think we've all been a bit disappointed that, where it was absolutely central in the 2009 manifestos, it has not been central in these manifestos. We're not getting a big push to what a government would do. So let's move to this issue of local governments in England. I think the word local government to many people just does not sound like the sexiest topic. And I expect people are sitting there thinking about, well, local government means bin collections and libraries. But councils, local governments are so much more. So let's just start with, what are local governments doing for us? Why are they having such a hard time? And why should everyone care about local government?
Well, yes. So in this election, obviously, it's local government in England that's the kind of key picture. Local government is responsibility for the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senedd in the devolved nations. But local government, it is bins, it is leisure centres, but it is much more than that. So even in 2010, before the sort of big cuts to local government funding during the 2010s, social care for adults and children was half of council's spending. It's now 2/3. So by far the biggest chunk of local government funding goes on the adults and children with particularly high needs, whether that's care at home, whether that's care in a residential care centre, or whether that's being foster care or looked after in a children's home. So huge amounts of funding going towards those areas. Councils also look after public health services, so things like STI clinics, anti-obesity, anti-smoking, drugs treatment. They look after lots of local economic development, lots of local public transport. So yes, the typical person's biggest interaction is making sure they put their bins out. I say once a week, once a fortnight, or once every 3 weeks nowadays. But they do so much more than that.
Yeah. And of course, most people on most days aren't accessing adult social care or child social care. But as you said, it's the majority of what local governments are doing. And for the people who are accessing it, these are absolutely critical services. I think one thing we've seen, David, and you can tell us some more about, is that there's been a big increase in demand for those services, for adult and child social care, and for, more children coming forward with special educational needs, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's one of the reasons why councils are struggling.
Yes, so if you look back to 2010, compared to then, councils are spending about 9% less per person on services overall. But spending on social care is up 18% per person. That's meant cuts to other areas. So, for example, housing is down by 1/3, planning, culture, local transport down by 40%, youth centres and Sure Start centres down by 70%. So the pressures on adult social care and children's social care have really meant big cuts to other areas of services. Now, part of that is demand. We've got an ageing population. Even more so for adults, it's actually more working age adults with learning disabilities. That's where the big growth in costs and demand has been coming from. I've also seen big increases in the cost per user over the last couple of years. So just a couple of statistics that could be sort of, exemplifying this. So since 2019, the number of homeless people in temporary accommodation in B&Bs is doubled.
Doubled
Wow. In 4 years.
So double the number of homeless people in temporary accommodation.
In B&Bs.
B&Bs, okay.
Which is the most expensive form of temporary accommodation and perhaps actually one of the least suitable for many people. We've seen around a third increase since 2019 in the numbers of children with special needs care plans. Now, that really affects the school's budget, which colleagues have been talking about. But for councils, the big impact there is on school transport. Councils need to pay for the minibuses or the taxis to take children to these schools. Spending on that, I think, has more than doubled over the last 3 or 4 years. Children's social care costs, there's now around, I think, 200 children where the cost is more than £1 million per year.
Per child.
Per child in social care. And the cost of adult social care has gone up by 35% in 4 years, double the rate of inflation. So these are huge
to sum up
pressures.
here, I mean, what most people will have seen is that the local government's doing less. They'll have seen some of the cuts to the core services you mentioned and so things that people use on a daily basis. And part of that was because there were some cuts to funding in the 2010s. But what you've set out is that a big part of that is that governments are doing different things. They're now spending more of their budgets on care, social care for adults and children. So it's not just that councils are doing less overall, they're doing different things and they're doing things that are focused on a smaller group.
Yeah, so for the typical person today, some of these things are not very visible. Most people don't interact with social care services, perhaps even over their full lifetime or towards the end of their lifetime. But yes, funding was cut in the 2010s. It's gone up since 2020, actually, like many public services. But because of these rising costs and rising demands outpacing inflation, it hasn't felt like that for councils. Councils' finances have been under pressure, and some of the services that we most like to interact with on a day-to-day basis are still being cut back.
So councils are really struggling. They are providing extremely important services. Some of them are going, effectively becoming bankrupt because they can't manage this situation. And yet, despite this kind of close crisis in local government, the main party's manifestos tell us basically nothing about the funding that councils can expect next year. And in fact, there's a good chance that they'll face cuts to central government grants. And even if they didn't, many of them would be having to cut their services. So unpack that for us. We've got this crisis, but manifesto's not telling us anything about how they might deal with the mess.
Yeah, so the manifestos from Labour, Conservatives and Lib Dems all do promise one thing councils have been asking for, that is multi-year funding settlements. That means they get told, several years in advance how much they'll have to spend. That makes it easier to plan. Councils will be pleased about that. We know that, but we don't know actually how much the settlements will be. There's no information at all on what government will provide councils with or what they can increase their own council tax by. So that means there's a lot of uncertainty about what the funding outlook will look like. But we do know from the sort of general public finance picture and from the sort of overall spending plan set out in the manifestos, if they're kept to, funding is going to be very tight across the public sector. And if council funding is not a sort of protected area, and it wasn't in the 2010s, that could mean cuts to the grant funding that councils get given. Now, that's maybe not as bad as it is for some services, because of course councils do have their own tax revenues. Council tax makes up more than half of their funding. Looking ahead, if it was to go up by 5% a year, the average over the last couple of years, that's actually quite a bit above the forecast inflation. That would generate some additional funding for councils. But if you add up that, combine that, even if the grant funding wasn't cut, that would give them about a 2.5% increase above inflation in their overall funding. If demand and cost pressures continue to grow at the rate they have been over the last couple of years, they'd need 4.5% to meet the rising costs and demands. So we'd expect those pressures to slow down at some point, but we're not sure when and not sure by how much. So if they don't slow down significantly, even on an optimistic scenario, I guess, of flat funding from government and big council tax increases, there could be pressure to cut back certain services, and that could push more councils to the edge, joining the likes of Birmingham, Thurrock and Woking.
And that's what's really surprised me. So David put out a report this week that set out some scenarios for local government. And the thing that really surprised me is that even if you assume that council tax goes up by 5% a year, which would, be pretty high rates of increases, and even if the government actually kept funding the same in real terms, so avoided cuts, protected local government, even that probably wouldn't be enough, at least in the short run, to keep up with pressures. So local governments are almost certainly, unless something miraculous happens, going to be facing really tough times and having to choose what services to cut. And yet, if you look at the manifesto, nothing about that, nothing about how to prioritise services, which services are we going to cut, which children aren't going to get help, which adults aren't going to get help. Clearly a huge issue for people that's just not being discussed. Another thing I want to pick up, relating back to the levelling up stuff we had, is that we're always talking here about averages and different councils. Of course, huge variation across councils. And a big issue is that some councils, notably those in poorer areas, aren't as able to raise council tax as other areas. So actually, some councils are in a really bad state, even compared to what we've talked about, because they have these big pressures, but they haven't got a council tax base that's going to help them raise funding for it.
Well, yes. So the poorer councils tend to have more properties in low sort of bands. So a given percentage increase in their council tax raises them less revenues because people are paying lower bills on average there. That means that if councils are reliant on council tax for increases in funding and the grant is being held or even cut back, it's much harder for them to raise revenues. They could if they were allowed to increase their council tax by more, but recently there's been strict limits on what they can do so. And I think what that means is that even if these pressures do abate, we do see a slowdown in the demand and cost at a national level, because poorer areas can raise less through council tax, unless there is sort of a redistribution of that existing grant funding to them, they might struggle to keep pace with pressures, even if those pressures slow down significantly. So we run our scenarios. If, for example, council tax is up by 5% per year and grant funding is cut sort of in line with the average we think unprotected services could face, the richest areas could see increases in their funding overall of about 3%. The poorest areas, 1.3%, unless you see that grant redistribution. So quite stark differences in the ability to raise revenues there, unless the government grasps this nettle of reforming the funding system to make sure it reflects differences in needs and revenue-raising capacities across the country.
Obviously not a happy picture for local government. And the next central government, whatever colour it is going to have to tackle this. They're going to have to decide how much funding to give to local governments and how to reallocate it. Huge choices. And we have to, hope that they take that seriously and plan that carefully.
I think there's a point here as well about what it means to cut some of these services, because all of the manifestos talk about wanting to do more in terms of prevention. They want to have more Sure Start centres, family hubs, youth offender teams, programs to support people in the community. So those commitments are there. It's just that the money isn't there to help local government actually be able to do that preventative work when so much of their budget is being sucked up by acute services.
Yeah, so unless there's more spending than currently in the envelope set out, means more tax rises and more borrowing, that means more pressures on local government if they want them to be achieving these things.
So we come back to the same problem we've been highlighting on this podcast week after week after week. You can have more spending if you have higher taxes, or you can have lower taxes and less spending, but you can't keep promising to do more and not backing it up with money. Let's turn our attention now, sort of pan out a little bit and look at Wales and Scotland and the devolved governments and look at the manifestos of both Plaid Cymru and the SNP. Now, Christine, before we dig into the details of the manifesto, I want to make sure we've got listeners straight about kind of what we're talking about here. So can you summarise for people, what policy areas are devolved to Scotland and Wales? And when they're making the manifestos for this election, what are they talking about?
Yeah, so this is on July 4th, a UK general election for the Westminster government. That means that Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland are going to be electing and sending MPs to sit in the Westminster Parliament and make kind of UK-wide policy. For England, basically that's one and the same thing. For Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, you have to think about devolved issues. So health, education, local government, some taxes and benefits. For some of those countries, justice, prisons, that kind of thing. All of those are devolved issues, and that means the Westminster government doesn't directly make policy in those areas for the devolved nations. Now, they do still have an interest in what the Westminster government does, because to the extent that the Westminster government is spending more on those services in England and not finding that revenue by increasing taxes in England, there are implications for how much funding gets sent to the devolved nations for them to spend on their own priorities as well.
Great. So we're looking at what the parties are offering to voters in Scotland and Wales, but that has implications both for those people particularly and the rest of the UK. So David, let's come to you. What vision are Plaid Cymru offering to your fellow Welshmen?
So yes, Plaid Cymru have identified the same problem we have, that current plans by the Conservatives and Labour basically implicitly suggest cuts to many unprotected areas of spending. Now, those wouldn't directly apply in Wales because, as Christine just said, actually the UK government gives the Welsh government money, and it's then up to the Welsh government to decide how to spend on health, local government education. But it faces the same pressures as the UK government does, and so would therefore need to cut back on many areas if it wanted to protect the NHS, for example. So Plaid Cymru say that Wales should get a bigger share of the funding, as well as funding across the UK as a whole increasing. It says that Wales doesn't get a needs-based share at the moment. It complains that the Barnett formula is based on population. So it says we should replace that formula with a needs formula. Now, interestingly though, when the Welsh Government last looked at the needs of Wales, it thought they were about 14 to 17% higher than in England. The latest estimate of how much government spending is higher in Wales than England is 20% for those same services. So whilst Plaid Cymru is right.
Wales is getting a good deal at the moment.
Well, it's getting a good deal at the moment. Plaid Cymru is right. The Barnett formula, which is sort of based on population, it doesn't really make much sense. It is unfair. But because of historic features and some decisions over the last few years, Wales currently isn't doing badly compared to at least the existing estimates we have of spending needs. If it's still correct that it's 14 to 17% higher, not 20%, actually move to a needs-based system, could see Wales lose £1 billion of funding. So it's not clear that in the short term, at least, a move to a needs-based system would benefit Wales. Although in the long term, I think we all agree that we need a system that's sort of more rational, not based on sort of arbitrary sort of figures like the Barnett formula.
Stepping back, I mean, is it right to say that, so Plaid Cymru would like a bigger state, more spending. They have some pledges that are about issues that are actually devolved. So the Westminster MPs aren't going to be the people who can fix that directly. That's for the Welsh Parliament. But they would need more money. So partly they would like some more money to come from the rest of the UK and flow into Wales. But am I also right in saying that if they want to meet some of their pledges over devolved issues, they'd also need higher taxes in Wales?
Yeah, so Plaid Cymru have set out a range of sort of taxes that should go up at UK-wide level, higher taxes on energy companies, changing capital gains tax so it's more in line with income tax, which I think if done correctly, I think we'd actually say is a good thing to do here.
If done correctly is the key
If
there,
done correctly
yes.
is the key thing, yes. And also investing in increases in national insurance on higher earners as well. Now, that would raise more money to spend at a UK-wide level, and it would mean more money to Wales through the Barnett formula. At a UK-wide level, they also suggest making some changes to benefits that would affect households in Wales, for example, removing the 2-child limit in universal credit. But you're right, some of the kind of suggestions they make would require sort of higher taxes within Wales. So they, for example, suggest things like increasing social care spending, free childcare from 12 months, free school meals for all secondary school children. Given the funding outlook for the UK as a whole, it's unlikely we could fund those without sort of big cuts elsewhere unless we were to raise more in Wales. And Plaid Cymru also suggest having a £20 per child increase in child benefit, potentially alongside devolving powers over child benefits to Wales. To us, it looks like that would cost around £600 to £700 million per year if done in Wales alone. And if that wasn't being funded at a UK-wide level, that's about 2 pence on all income tax rates in Wales.
So broadly speaking, we should expect the Plaid Cymru MPs in Westminster to be kind of campaigning, fighting, trying to get more money for Wales in general, maybe more tax devolution powers. They have power to raise taxes. And then within the Welsh Government, looking to raise more money in order to increase spending on some of the services that you've set out.
Exactly, yeah. I think what we'll see is a push for higher spending overall at UK-wide level, a reform to the system so that there's a needs-based funding system, although I said in the short term it's not clear that would benefit Wales, and then tax devolution and tax increases at a UK-wide level so that there's more scope to raise revenue to sort of fund those ambitions.
And actually there's a lot of overlap here, therefore, with what the SNP are offering to Scottish voters, in the sense that they would also like to see a bigger state, both UK-wide and in particular in Scotland. They'd like more devolution powers, but would also need to be raising money in Scotland to fund some of the devolved issues. So to talk us through the high-level stuff there.
Yeah, so let's start with what they say about UK-wide public spending and what that would mean for Scotland. So they've called for a pretty substantial increase in spending, both for day-to-day spending and for capital investment. So the SNP say they would push for £18 billion extra per year by the end of the Parliament for unprotected services. Now, coincidentally, that's a figure that IFS has sort of previously said cuts could be coming in the sort of current spending envelopes that have been set out.
So credit to them, they're not engaging with the conspiracy of silence. They are telling us how they would meet the challenge, and the way they would meet the challenge is by increasing borrowing predominantly to increase spending.
Well, yes, we'll come on to the kind of how they're going to fund it in a second. They also say that it would increase NHS spending above and beyond what we think is needed to meet the NHS's long-term workforce plan by a total of £16 billion a year. Now, you take that together, and they say that you'd get an extra £1.6 billion for the NHS in Scotland by the end of the Parliament, and Scotland could also avoid cuts to unprotected services. Now, on the investment side, they also say cancel the cuts that are implicit in the existing plans and immediately find £28 billion a year to invest in the green economy. Now, that is, of course, what Labour previously said they would spend per year. In the long term, I'm sure you could actually get spending to that level. I think in the short term, you want to ramp it up slowly to make sure you're spending it correctly. But you take all this together, you look at the kind of spending pledges, there's about £90 billion a year in additional spending planned on the day-to-day spending side and the capital spending side in the SNP manifesto.
It's a big number.
So a big number. How would they fund that? Partly through increases in taxes. They suggest a number of tax rises similar to what the Lib Dems and Labour are proposing, for example, on VAT on private schools or taxing share buybacks, for example. They also suggest England, Wales and Northern Ireland, so the UK government, could go down the same route on income tax as Scotland, so increase income tax on higher earners. That would mean about a £1,600 an increase for someone on 50,000, more like £5,000 increase for someone on 125,000.
Of course, both of the main parties, the Tories and the Labour, have ruled that out, so
yep.
Unlikely to happen. But
unlikely to happen. And then they say that by rejoining the EU, the UK could see a boost to its economy, and that would raise an additional £30 billion.
Again, possible but unlikely to happen.
Well, indeed, in the short term. But it's what they're setting out as their stall to help fund this. And actually, incidentally, £30 billion isn't an unrealistic estimate of what you could get from the additional tax revenues from faster growth and, offsetting that some contributions to the EU budget. But as you say, whether that'll happen in the next Parliament or even in sort of longer term seems a little bit unlikely given the current state of politics at a UK-wide level. That means that, £90 billion of spending, about £65 billion of taxes going up or extra revenue. So they suggest £25 billion, even on their figures, of additional borrowing, which they'd fund by loosening the fiscal rules effectively.
So a bigger state offer both of there. Before we wrap up, I just want to kind of, obviously lots of differences between Plaid Cymru and SNP and between Wales and Scotland. But one thing that both parties are saying is that they'd like independence from the rest of the UK. But what you said is that neither of them are really being honest about what that would cost. So big picture, tell us about that.
Well, yeah, so both parties, SNP and Plaid, have correctly identified the sort of austerity that's implicit for many services in the UK party's plans for public spending and taxation. They've been a little bit less sort of honest about what their key platforms might mean, at least in the short to medium term, for public spending and taxation in Scotland and Wales. So they both highlight that, there's potential to do different choices and hope that in the medium to long term, that could mean a better economic performance for Scotland and Wales. But here is the number of the issue. Currently, both Scotland and Wales get significantly higher public spending than England, but they don't raise more revenues. And in fact, in Wales, raise substantially less in revenues because it's unfortunately a poorer part of the UK. That means at the moment there's quite big fiscal transfers to Scotland and Wales, which if they became independent countries would no longer be the case. They need to fund their spending themselves. That would mean a big budget deficit at the start of independence that would need to be addressed over time. Now, in the very long term, potentially, yes, with better policies, maybe rejoining the EU once you adjust your trade patterns to reflect the fact you're no longer part of the UK, your biggest trading partner now, maybe in the long term, yes, you could potentially get a bigger economy and fund public services and benefits that way without tax rises or spending cuts. But in the short term, that's not going to happen. In the short term, what you would need to do is to either cut back spending or increase taxes to get your budget sustainable so you can actually still go to the markets and borrow, avoid a Liz Truss moment. That is something that just really isn't there in the manifestos. And I think, if you're thinking about the kind of scale of cuts that is coming forward under the existing UK party's plans, the cuts for independence, at least in the short to medium term, will be several times larger in Scotland, a full order of magnitude times larger in Wales. So I think they've been correct in identifying the sort of problems in the current spending plans of the UK parties. They've been a lot less honest and willing to really dig down into what their main proposals mean for people in Wales and Scotland.
Great. So we should wrap up this episode soon. We've heard about big challenges that we already have in the UK and big challenges that we would have in implementing some of the visions that we've seen put forward in this election. I promised listeners at the start that I would leave us on a more optimistic note, having been a bit gloomy through quite a lot of this. So Christine, let's start with you. Tell us something that you're optimistic about and hopeful about.
So you sort of tipped us off, Helen, that this was coming, and I think our broad reaction was panic. But having had half an hour to reflect on it, I think my optimism comes from having gone back to look at the Levelling Up report, actually. That, to me, was a really good demonstration that when you get political capital and buy-in across government and you get the civil service on side and give them time and space to actually do some serious long-term thinking, it is possible to pull together strategies and policies and targets that at least attempt to tackle big long-term issues. Whether or not you're able to actually progress that agenda and deliver that's different.
Gloomy. Let's stay on the high note. The high note is there that, some serious work was done. We don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. We identified some problems. Maybe the missions could be tweaked, but we have set a framework now for thinking about this. So the next government, whoever they are, can come in and actually kind of continue that agenda and pick up on those things. I think that's a good hopeful message. David, what are you hopeful about?
So I think, we're at a stage where it's obvious there are big problems in local government. It's obvious that more councils are approaching the sort of financial cliff. And I think that, that isn't in itself hopeful. But sometimes crises, they do, prompt change. So I think the issues have got so significant in local government that I'm hopeful that it'll be recognised and that, not that necessarily will be huge pots of central government funding coming towards local government's way, but one of several things can happen. One, give local government more powers to raise revenues itself. Two, look at what local government is doing and actually work out, as you say, what it can afford to do and what it needs to maybe pay back on. So I think we're at a stage where we might actually get someone to grasp some of these tricky issues, not necessarily a really rosy outcome, but actually, stop sleepwalking into a further crisis.
Okay, that sounds a little bit like things can only get better, but we'll take that optimistic outlook. Look, for me, I think I'm optimistic partly because although there are loads of challenges, they're big, they're long running, they're really hard to tackle. I think we do have good ideas, we being, we in the IFS, but also more broadly in the policy community, good ideas about how to tackle some of these things. There's loads of potential out there in the country. There are things we could absolutely do better. We know about a lot of the policy levers that we would need to move. So we're not facing here a challenge where we're all sitting here thinking, oh my God, we have no idea how to tackle the education of our young people, the social care of children and adults. We do have some ideas here. So I think having identified the problems, hopefully the next government will find some energy to start looking for those solutions. But thank you all for listening to this special episode of the IFS Zooms In. We'll be back next week with our definitive analysis of the Labour and Conservative Party manifesto, so do tune in for that. To see more of our work, which we are currently churning out almost literally around the clock, please visit www.ifs.org.uk. And if you enjoyed this episode or any of our other work, please do share it with a friend and consider further supporting us by becoming a member for just £10 a month. You can find more details in the episode description. We hope to see you next time.